Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me okay in the back? Dan Titus, can you hear it back? Great. This is really a very, very gratifying as I look out here and see you. Tonight we have a crowd of a little more than 200 when you throw in the Zoom people as well as the people sitting here in the audience. Very gratifying thank you for all of you folks to end the 2023-24 Michael Crowley Lecture Series season. Another banner season for the lectures, another banner year for the museum. And I also want to mention tonight, we have a little entertainment along with this. Is at the end of the night, we're going to have the drawing of the fundraising raffle. And so 3 people are going to go home with a few extra pennies in their pocket, and 227 people are going to go home a little poorer. I think there's only a few people that can, a handful of people that can fill an audience for an Irish lecture. And 2 of them are in the audience, and you will remember them from past. Dr. Scott Malloy. Scott, raise your hand there. Stand up. There you go, Scott. Thank you. Yeah. And Dr. Kurt Schlichting in the back row over here. Dr. Kurt, great to have you with us. And the third person that can do that is in the front row over here, Steve Marino. Steve, good to have you here. Yeah. We also have with us a very special guest tonight. Third row on this side is May Honeyfeld. And when I say special, she was the inspiration for this evening's lecture, the cutter race. She is a direct descendant of one of the rowers that rowed out of Sneem, County Kerry, that rowed against the Hibernian rowers in 1905. Great to have you with us. And you'll hear a lot more about that from Steve. That was just a short introduction there. Couple administrative notes, entertainment-wise, this weekend. Saturday, 12:30, St. Mary's Cemetery. Steve will be giving his guided tour of St. Mary's. And then on Sunday at 3 p.m. Will be the reenactment of the Dancing at 40 Steps on Cliff Walk. And that will kind of wind up this March season. We're getting a little tired of the green, you know, it's that's right, never. I don't have to say a lot about Steve Marino. You've heard him before. Very, very gifted and talented speaker and presenter. He's now one of our resident historians at the museum. He's the operations manager of the Interpretive Center. He's a tour guide extraordinaire, and I always mention this because if you're going to take a tour of either the summit or Fort Adams in particular, make sure that you ask for Steve, Enzo Marino. And it's really a gifted tour at Fort Adams. He also does the tours of St. Mary's Cemetery and Varney Street Cemetery, and he's been doing them all month of March. He's a retired history teacher who really left his mark, and I'll just say he's got at least one of his students in the audience tonight that vouch for that. And I have a letter. I have a letter from one of his students that I'm not going to read now, excerpts. I asked permission to read a few excerpts, and I'm going to wait so I don't put undue pressure on him. We'll wait till after your presentation. But I want you to hear this, what students that haven't seen him in 12 years, what they remember about him. It's just remarkable. He's a lifelong learner. He was educated at Williams College, Brown University, and the Hartford Seminary. And Steve, I'm going to let you talk about the cutters. Have at it.
Wow, I'm glad he didn't read what my former student had to say. But speaking of former students, I always told my history students, never depend on newspapers when you're doing historical research. Be very, very cautious. I am going to ignore that good advice tonight because I am relying exclusively almost on newspapers. And you know what else? Because it's Irish Heritage Month, I decided I'd base a lot of this just on stories. Stories that I've been told, stories that May has been told, because it's Irish Heritage Month, right? And that's a big part of Irish heritage, is telling stories in pubs. And if you love sports, and if you ever wagered a time or two on sports, you're really going to love this. Okay. May is my inspiration. And the reason she is she came into the Museum of Newport Irish History 5, 6 years ago, is it? Yeah. And she saw this photograph, the photograph that's supposed to be up there, but isn't. That one. And she saw this photograph and she said, oh, Michael Brennan is my grandmother's brother. It's my grandmother's brother. And I said, whoa, that's really cool. She said, the family knew about this photograph for years, but no one ever had seen it. My grandfather just told us, my granduncle just told us about it. And when she saw it, you were pretty excited. You'd been looking for it for a long time, which got me excited. And she said, I can't believe the names are down there. All 12 of the names and the coxswain. This guy is called a coxswain, and his name was Martin Shea. And he was a blacksmith, the old Colony Railroad. And she said, oh my gosh. And she went home and started to research the people. And I got intrigued with this whole cutter thing. But let's get right to the race, right? Let's talk about the race. This race was between 12 sailors off the USS Kearsarge, which was a battleship in the Atlantic Squadron of the United States Navy. And they were the champions of the Navy fleet. And they challenged 12 guys from Ireland and a coxswain from the Hibernia Boat Club in Newport. All right? That doesn't sound fair. And the Boston Globe was all over this. The Boston Globe reported, this is a few days before the race, crews to race on Friday at the end of the week. And the Hibernians are favored over the Kearsarge in the $1,000 contest. Now that suggests that people were interested in betting on this, doesn't it? And it kind of surprised me because the Hibernians were the favorites. They were like 5-3 favorites in this. The Newport Daily News also ran an article, and they had a more local flavor to their article. And I'm just going to read a little bit to you. I hate it when people read to me, but the newspapers are just so much fun back in 1905. You can follow along. Last night, the long talked of match between the Kearsarge and the Hibernian crews was clinched by the putting up of the money. Okay. They might not even have a race if the money wasn't there. Finally, as the hour of 9 p.m. approached, Mr. McGowan's place on Washington Square became the center of the town, for there the stakes were put up and side bets were registered. Now, what's going on at McGowan's place on Washington Square, do you suppose? Well, McGowan's place was a restaurant. First-class restaurant. Strictly first-class restaurant. And it was at 12 Washington Square. And McGowan was the promoter. He was the publicist. He was the spokesperson for the Hibernia Boat Club. You got to understand something about the Hibernia Boat Club. There was no clubhouse. There were no other members. There was no boathouse. Okay. And they were not associated with the ancient order of Hibernians. Let's get that straightened out right off the bat. They had nothing to do with the AOH. Okay. This intrigued me. And this is so what was going on at McGowan's? It goes on. In front of McGowan's, there was a crowd which stretched to the car tracks. And inside, apparently, there was room for no more until someone came out. The stakes were put up, $500 aside, and the money which the Kearsarge men had brought over to bet on the side was covered. And so not only did they bring over $500 to cover each side, but they brought in sacks and sacks of money, equaling $4,000. And then Charlie McGowan, in his fine restaurant, people would come in and cover those bets, people from town, and everybody wanted to bet on the Hibernians. And everybody in the Navy evidently wanted to bet on the Kearsarge. And the Boston Globe reported that the sailors had to have many sacks of money because most of them were filled with nickels and quarters. Yeah. Yeah. The sailors emptied out every nickel they had to bet on their champions. And then the Globe goes on, and forgive me, every night that week when the sailors came ashore, I wanted to tell you this first. That's Charlie McGowan's, Daniel McGowan's first-class restaurant. It's the Bank of Newport now. Okay, so that building isn't there. It has big pillars in front of it now. And I went over to look at it today and took a couple of photographs. It's right across from what was then City Hall. We'll talk about that in a second. But every night when the sailors came ashore, they hastened to rendezvous points where enthusiastic, confident supporters of the Hibernians were waiting to accept all offers. Charlie Sullivan, a believer in the prowess of the Hibernians, had $7,000 locked in his safe. DJ McGowan, backer of the Hibernian crew, had nearly $8,000, which had been deposited with him by civilians and sailors the night before. Huh? And then it goes on. No one can compute the amount involved. For men who could not see how the Hibernians could lose, not only put up all they themselves had, but induced their mothers, sisters, and wives to draw their money from their savings and wager it. It was impossible to escape contact with the fever. And few were there who were not affected by the contagion. It was crazy. And this is the best part. Well, no, it was not alone confined to Newport, for letters and telegrams came from Fall River, Providence, and even New York, asking for information as to the chances of the respective crews. Sporting men, okay, sporting men, you can just use your imagination about that. Sporting men in these cities all had placed money. And in New York, it is said that the sailors of the Brooklyn Navy Yard had succeeded in risking some $3,000 on the oarsmen of the Kearsarge. This was getting crazy, okay? And everything I just read was in this amazing article in the Boston Globe the day after the race. And I can't show you the front page, but above the fold in the front page was a headline as to who won the race. It was incredible. They even said a photographer. After the front page story that ran down the middle of the front page, then they had a full page story on the race. And then it went on to another page. And at the end, they said this boat race was for over $20,000 bet. That's what they figured. Now, $20,000 in today's money is about $250,000 bet on this. Okay. So because the stakes were so high and because there was so much riding on this race, they had to find somebody to be the referee, the judge, the man who's going to make the decisions on how the race was run. A man beyond reproach. And who did they get? Patrick Boyle. Remember Patrick Boyle? Mayor, yes, mayor. And that's City Hall, right across Washington Square from Charlie McGowan's fancy restaurant. So you can tell the story any way you want. So Mayor Boyle becomes the judge, the referee. Yeah. And just to add, I'm going to go back to Charlie McGowan. Okay, just take a peek at this because the article goes on. In front, there was a crowd which stretched to the car tracks. Oh, no, I already read that. Did I? Yeah, sorry. Okay, this was the race. It was a 4-mile straightaway race. And it started way out here off the map, off Gould Island, if you're familiar with that, north of the bridge. It was 4 miles straight away and it ended at Long Wharf. This is Long Wharf, right? Okay. And when the race started, you couldn't even see the two cutters. They were 4 miles away. People on boats went out there, a few people, and the first people to see them were on the Navy base at Coasters Island. And then at that time, the Navy base was the War College and the training school for apprentice sailors. And then it reached the point, and this little speck is Battery Park, which was then called Fort Greene. And then at the end, everybody could see them from either Long Wharf area or the torpedo station. Okay. But I want to tell you what a cutter is. That's a cutter. And that's a close-up of a cutter. And it's from 1905, which is kind of cool. But if you're a boat builder, it's really fascinating, but I'm not going to go through all that. It had a rudder and a tiller. And the oars were probably as important as the boat. Okay. And I know there's some rowers in here or some relatives of rowers that I'm going to be interested to see what you think of this. Every boat in the Navy had one. Every ship in the Navy had one. And it was for ship to shore and ship to ship transportation of things. Okay. Just a quick Google search gave me the U.S. Maryland cutter, the U.S. South, both battleships. And this one is especially interesting. It says, this is a postcard. Right. And I have it here. It's a postcard you can still buy down in the shops. And it says, Naval Rhode Island Boat Cutter Navy Training Station. So if you were a sailor in the United States Navy, one of the things you did is learn how to row. I mean, that's what you did up there. So the training station had lots of cutters. You could even borrow one if you wanted to. Okay, so cutters were very familiar. And this is my favorite photograph of a cutter right there. This is a United States Navy cutter right here. And it obviously has left a big ship out in the harbor, and it's come in, and it's either picking up the mail or leaving the admiral off, and they're just chilling, right? And they're waiting, and you can see the other sailors having a cigarette on the dock, and these guys are just sitting around waiting, and they're going to bring the boat back with something. And they're big utility boats. and every ship had them. So they're very, very common sight in the 1905 Newport Harbor. Okay, now, the first documented race between cutters on July 4th was in 1905. And if you notice, it's a Navy thing. I mean, it was a Navy thing, two Navy establishments, the Naval Reserves, and it also was up at the Navy base and the torpedo station. It was raining, so it kind of stunk, but a lot of people showed up. A lot of people showed up, and the Naval Reserves won. And then the Newport Daily News gave the list of people that were rowing in both. It's not important who the people are, but if there is an Irishman in there, he's hiding. This is not an Irish thing. This is not an Irish story. It's a Navy story. It's a Navy thing. And I don't know. That's important to understand. In 1896, I mean, to tell you how unpopular this was, or it was fledgling, there was no race in 1896. In 1897, this guy changes everything. Okay. And his name was Frederick Garretson. And he was an importer, exporter of fine beverages. Now, I immediately went to liquor, but it was also coffees and teas, right? Tea was a big deal. And he was a real blue blood. He had bloodlines that went back to colonial days and the Revolution. He was well-educated at Dartmouth. And he ran an upscale food and beverage emporium. Guess where? Washington Square. And Garretson, he started giving a cup. He said, whoever wins the July 4th race, you're going to get a silver cup, which he named after himself, and $100. $100. First time ever that a prize was given for one of these races. And I don't want to dump on Fort Adams because we have a lot of Fort Adams people here. The 1897 race, I think Fort Adams showed up in a metal boat. And they said, no, you can't do that. This is not that kind of race. But somebody else showed up with 10 rowers. Somebody else showed up on a whaleboat. And Garretson said, look, we're going to standardize this race. You, in order to win the cup and in order to win the $100, you gotta have a 12-oared cutter. All right. So Garretson did that. But the other thing he did is he changed the course. I mean, this is the course. It started on Long Wharf, went up to Battery Park, and then it came back. Mile and a quarter, mile and a half. It required a turn, which took a lot of skill. And I think what he's doing, that race, you could see the beginning, the middle, and the end. You could stand on Commercial Wharf, which was then the Old Colony Railroad Yard. You could stand at the torpedo station. You could stand on one of those wharfs and like at Elm Street or something like that. And you could see the entire race, right? It became a sporting event. See, it wasn't something that started a million. It wasn't the America's Cup that was out in the ocean. Okay. And it wasn't one of those rich people things like the polo matches where you had to walk 2 miles. This was something that was for the people of Newport. Now, Garretson had some political aspirations. He wanted to get more well-known to the people in Newport because he was going to run. So he establishes this Garretson Cup. And from the type of boat was standardized. The date of the race, July 4th. July 4th, that's when we're going to have the race. Unless it's so miserable, we'll have it on July 5th. He standardized first time. You're going to win some money. And the course. And this was every single July 4th, there were ringing of the bells. Then they had a parade in Newport. And then after the parade, however long it took, there was going to be the cutter race. And it was insanely popular. Everybody came down for the cutter race. Okay, a few people waging on it, maybe more than a few people waging on it. Okay, but it was steady. It was always there. Every once in a while, there was a challenge on Labor Day, and there was another race. They even raced sometimes on Decoration Day, which we call Memorial Day. And it was it was great. It was fun. It was fun, and it was free. If you didn't bet, it was free. Or it didn't cost a penny to go down and watch the cutter races. So this is too unbelievable to be true. When I investigated Fritz Gerritsen, I was interested to see where his emporium of fine beverages was. And his beverage emporium was right next to Dan McGowan's restaurant. I'm not kidding. I'm not making it up. I have some analogies in present day Newport, but I'm not saying any of them. It's crazy. And Gerritsen infusion of money into this race got other competitors involved. So there was the first civilian boat came from the Old Colony Railroad Yard. And now this is the Old Colony Railroad Yard where Commercial Wharf and the boatyard are today, right? The end of Washington Street over here in the point. This is Long Wharf. This is Long Wharf. And that's what Long Wharf looked like in 1905, right? And they were neighbors. I'm sure they had lunch together. I'm sure everybody at the Old Colony Railroad Yard knew the people on Long Wharf. And one afternoon, this is my story now, one afternoon they wandered over and saw a boat builder right here. This guy, his name was Louis Raymond. And he made wooden boats for the steamship companies. So the Old Colony guys, probably on lunch one day, or maybe even after work, went over and talked to Louis Raymond and said, do you think you could build us a 12-oared cutter that's fast and sleek with spoon oars? And he said, I would really like to try that. And so by the spring of 1898, there was this new cutter. And they competed against the old Navy clunker utility boats. Yeah, you know who won, the Old Colony Railroad, right? And this Navy event started to become a Newport event. The 1899 race, the Navy got there. Okay, we're going to get our best battleship, the crew of the USS Indiana. And they went up against the Old Colony Railroad and they got slaughtered. And guess who bet on the Indiana? Every single sailor in the fleet. And everybody knew by 1899, it's Louis Raymond. He's the key. You got to have a Louis Raymond boat. That's what's doing it. I mean, there's nothing special about the Old Colony rowers. It's a Louis Raymond boat you need. And the other thing, it's the first time the Newport Daily News came right out and just talked about how much betting there was. Yeah. Which brings me to the 1902 race, and I'm going to skip a bunch of races because I want this story to get Irish. This is the Irish thing. And it gets Irish in 1902 in more ways than one. There's a new competitor, and it's the Hibernia Boat Club, which never existed. Okay. And it was 12 guys from Ireland and Martin Shea. And Martin Shea was a recognizable figure, actually. Martin Shea had been the coxswain on the Old Colony boat. Oh, and he literally jumped ship and he ends up as the coxswain of the Hibernia. Now you got to understand something about Martin Shea. Martin Shea was a performer. He always wore a derby hat and he danced around during the races and he had his hand on the tiller and he danced around and he waved his derby hat, just like, say, exhorting his guys to do all sorts of stuff. And you could hear him. You could hear him from the shore. He was a showman. This was a show for this guy. And think about him in that nice little 1.5-mile race, right? People came down to watch Martin Shea. And here he is, a member of the Hibernia Boat Club. And this is where I owe May everything. Because May actually started to do some research on these guys. Now, she knew her family came from a little town in Cary on Kenmare Bay called Sneem. Sneem. Anybody ever been to Sneem? Has anybody got relatives, ancestors from Sneem? Yeah. We'll talk. And then she did some work. Christy Burns. Interestingly, he came from Sneem, as well as James. And who's that? David Fitzgerald. He didn't come from Sneem. He came from the next town, next to Sneem. And Michael Casey came from Sneem. And James Malvey came from Sneem. And Thomas Brennan, the cousin of Michael Brennan, he came from Sneem. As far as we know, they all came from Sneem. This was the dream team from Sneem. And the other amazing thing that May did, shows you what kind of person she is and how much she was into this. And God bless her family. She actually went to Sneem. She wanted to get to the bottom of this. So she went to Sneem. Yeah. And when she got there, she immediately knew why Sneem had such great rowers. Because it was a lot. This is really the house that Christy Burns grew up in Sneem, one of the rowers. And you could see it's right on this estuary, right? And this was his house, and that back there is Sneem, right? It was way easier to get into that boat right there and go to Sneem and row back than it was taking the road. And Michael Brennan and Mike Casey, they all lived in these conditions, and they all started rowing when they were little kids. Then when they were 20-something, they were the world's best rowers. And then, like any good historical researcher, especially if you're Irish, what she did next is go to the pub in Sneem. And when she got to the pub in Sneem, wouldn't you know that somebody had the story? Okay. And it was a little confusing, the story. It's been generations being passed down in the pubs in Sneem. And the story they had was that one of the Vanderbilts, Oh yeah, there's a lot of characters in this story. One of the Vanderbilts financed the dream team from Sneem, and he was behind it. Now, my question immediately is, why would a Vanderbilt do that? Right. And when May came back from Sneem and told me this is what they told her, and she told me, she asked me, see if you could find a connection between one of the rowers and Vanderbilt. And I did. I tried. No. It was impossible. I found out where they lived. They all lived down the 5th Ward. I found out where they worked. all of them were just laborers or listed as laborers in the city directory. One of them was listed as a bartender, and I think I know where. But, and, and I have a suspect and a theory. Okay, it's an Irish story. So it's mine. I could tell it any way I want. All right. I told you the story would get Irish. It's getting Irish. This is my story. My chief suspect in this is this guy, one of Cornelius Vanderbilt's grandsons. And his name is Willie K. That's what they called him back then. William Kissam Vanderbilt Jr. And I just love this photograph because this guy has some dough. This guy is wealthy. Look at that. The boots and the fur collar and the goggles and the hang-arounds in the back in this enormous car in 1905. He was driving this thing. It was a big, fast car. He loved fast cars. He loved fast boats, right? He loved fast sailboats. He loved fast horses. He was a real competitor. But that's not the reason I think he financed this. What happens in 1900 is Willie K. Vanderbilt is driving that car up and down Aquidneck Avenue as fast as he can go. And people are just terrified of it. And so they go to Mayor Boyle, the star of my show, and Mayor Boyle threatens him. They say, listen, we're going to arrest you if you keep going this fast. And then he hits somebody, a kid. He hits somebody. Doesn't kill him, but he hits him, a child. And even the New York Times reported on this. It was a big deal. And it was down on Lower Thames Street, this monster. And he hits a kid, and Mayor Boyle's furious. The Irish community is furious. And somebody at this time of immense vulnerability says, you know how you can make this better? You can finance the Hibernia Boat Club. You want to atone for your sins? Right? And I think that he was a little vulnerable. And what's a couple of $1,000s to buy it? Right? By the way, this is a brand. I wanted to do one of those colorizing things. This is a green boat. They painted the boat green. Yeah, yeah. And and they paid for it. They paid for a brand new Lewis Raymond boat painted green. All right. And they said, we'll take on all comers. No one knew how good this team was. And there were other boats, the Temperance Society, the Old Colony Railroad that had a Lewis Raymond boat. And of course, the Naval Reserve and their clunker. The Naval Reserve came in last. And the Hibernia Boat Club just clobbered them. Okay. It worked. It worked. And remember, people are betting on them. Okay. And now there was a reason to bet more. Now, there was something they did after the 1902 season, and it really kind of puzzled me. What they did is they sold the boat that just won. They sold their cutter. And this is the article. At the famous green cutter of the Hibernian Boat Club, which Mr. Raymond built last spring, has been sold and delivered to the crew of the U.S. battleship Alabama. Yeah, some of you are getting this. Yeah. See? All right. You're complaining about bad boats. We're going to sell you our boat. Let's get you back in it. Which includes the spoon oars. Since the cutter was delivered to the battleship, her racing crew has been steadily in practice and issued a challenge to any ship that flies the stars and stripes. Okay, so the Navy gets back in the game. That's the purpose of this. And then talk about a publicist. Talk about something that would be just as great today as it was back in 1905. That happens in November after the season is over. The Hibernians had won the big race, the Garrettson Cup. And then next spring, this is my favorite. This evening at 6 o'clock, what is it? In May? Yeah, it's in May. This evening at 6 o'clock, the new racing cutter of the Hibernia Boat Club will be launched with appropriate ceremony from his shop of the builder, Louis F. Raymond on Long Wharf. His honor, Mayor Boyle, will name the boat Hibernia, and her lines show her to be a fast craft. Coxswain Martin Shea, okay, will be featured. Yeah, again, handle the tiller. And the crew will be made up pretty much of the same men who pulled in the former race boat last summer. The crew will go into training at once and prepare for the races during the summer. This is an advertisement. This is to lure people to bet for the Hibernians, right? And it's going to be a fast boat. And the day after this, I didn't want to bore you with too many newspaper articles. There's a newspaper article from the Fall River Herald. It talks about the ceremony. And Mayor Boyle is there with a bottle of champagne, right? With a rowboat. And hi, christening, Hibernia, and smashes a bottle of champagne and the foghorns and the cheering crowd. Oh, this is going to be the best summer ever. The best summer ever. And it really was, because in 1903, the Hibernians, in 1903, sorry, the Hibernians win the Garrettson Cup. And then there's a challenge in Labor Day. And the training station had a good crew and rode well, but the Hibernians outclassed them. And then the Hibernians took it on the road because they were making gobs of money. And they went up to Boston. And they said, we'll race anybody up here too for $1,000 a side, which is pretty high stakes considering 10 times the Garrettson Cup. And then in 1904, the sailors tried to do it again. The battleship Massachusetts, the flagship of the fleet, got creamed. They came in third out of 3. And the Hibernians win. And then in 1905, they win again. They win again. Which brings us, Navy gets beaten. The Hibernians keep winning, which brings us to the big race in 1905. I'm sure you're all interested in who won. Some of you know, you cheated and went to Google. Okay, this is from the Boston Globe again. Okay, the Globe story ran the day after the race, and this is the way they called the race. The Hibernians, they got towed out way out here, and 4 miles out, I think they got, and one of the officers on the Kearsarge said, this is the finest the Navy has. If we can't win today, we should never compete again. That's how high the stakes were for this race. Well, I tried to do this, but my skills aren't that great. The Hibernians started off vigorously. Coxswain Shea stood at the tiller, all animation, coaching his men and swaying his body to mark the strokes. The Hibernians dug into the water and rowed at a snappy stroke, their intent being to jump their craft along. The oarsmen of the Navy had a smoother start and hit the longer swinging stroke, which was only 33 to the minute. Coxswain Rose in the Kearsarge, in contrast to his tillerman on the green boat, sat motionless in the stern with his chin resting on the palm of his hand. At the training station, right? That was the first mile. At the training station, the Kearsarge cutter, the champions of the Navy, were stimulated to greater effort by the throng of the apprentices on the shore. Scores of young sailors were in the rigging of the old ship Constellation, and hundreds ran along the rocks, cheering and urging the Kearsarge on. After passing the training station on the 3rd mile, the Navy cutter went faster under a quicker stroke, while the Hibernians, who had been rowing at high pressure, reduced theirs some. But the men in green showed no signs of weakening, although by that time, the Kearsarge was in the lead. The Kearsarge, but after the 3rd mile, there was no chance for the landsmen. The naval champions took things easier, and although for about a quarter of a mile, the Hibernians spurted desperately, the gap was not reduced. The Kearsarge men swung gracefully over the line, having rowed the 4 miles in 29 minutes. The Hibernians exerted themselves gamely until their boats finished off the end of Long Wharf a full 38 seconds later. An appropriate whoa. Yeah. Scott, the fever was broken. It really was. Nobody had the heart to do this again. They had been fleecing the Navy for years. A sailor and his money are soon parted. Is that the way it goes? And they got back at him. The Navy left that day to do maneuvers out to sea. And so the sailors got immediately back on their boats and left. And everybody in Newport were just shaking their heads. Charlie McGowan was the only guy in town who wanted to have a rematch. And the fever was gone, but the legend lived on. I just want to share these. This is from 1933. This is Michael Brennan obituary. And at the end, it says he was a member of the famous Hibernian racing crew, which won many victories several years ago. And then it says, so it was in his obituary that he did this. This is one of the finest things he did. This one is especially interesting. The death of Patrick Sullivan of Boston. A lot of these guys went home to Ireland or to Boston. They left town. It was recalled that he was a member of the old Hibernian racing boat crew that was active 40 years ago. They're still talking about this 40 years later in Newport. 3 members of the crew are still living. You know, they keep track. They remember. David Fitzgerald of Prospect Hill Street, and Christy Burns of this city, and Michael Casey of Ireland. They were still alive. And Mike Casey, when he went home to Ireland, he went home to Sneem, and he married a woman named Bridget Sullivan. And they had 11 kids, 7 boys, and 3 girls, and they were enormous. Yeah, these were 4 of the boys. And the guy on the right is Steve Casey, Mike Casey's son. He was the firstborn. He was 6'4". He was enormous. And the story, by the way, of these Casey brothers, look that up. Look them up. Because you know that movie, The Boys in the Boat, that was just, anybody seen the movie, The Boys in the, yeah, that guy missed the story. Clooney, right? George Clooney, he missed the story. The real story are these guys. They would have won. They tried out for the 1936 Olympics, and they were going to represent Great Britain. But they were so poor that to make money, they wrestled. They made gobs of money wrestling. And because of that, see, you were a professional if you made money. And they got disqualified. And everybody says if they had gone to the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, they would have swept all 6 races. So they got the movie wrong. Well, there was a better story. These guys. Steve Casey, the oldest one, the biggest guy, he becomes Seriously, he became the world heavyweight champion wrestler. Pretty famous if you're over 90 years old. And speaking of which, one of the Casey brothers, not Steve, one of the Casey brothers, and I just been in contact with this fella. Okay, they wrote a book about the Casey brothers, the toughest family on earth. Another talk for another day. This guy here is the grandson of Mike Casey, who goes home after the Hibernians lose in 1905. And he's 90 years old. That's his birthday party that took place this year. Yeah. He's 90 years old. This is crazy. Both his daughters flanking him were champion rowers. He was for Great Britain. He was the coach for the Great Britain Olympic team in rowing for years. He recently retired. This is the best part. Save the best part for the end. His granddaughter, also a direct descendant from Mike Casey. Last year, her name is Victoria Carroll, I think. That's her dad right there. She rowed, R-O-W-E-D, rowed across the Atlantic Ocean with another woman in the boat, in a rowboat. They didn't get out of the row. Yeah. Yeah. 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean in a rowboat, 2 hours on, 2 hours off until they finished. Very few people do it. You gotta be, you really have to be, the bloodlines of the Hibernia boat crew. What I would love to have you do is when next time you go to Ireland, I know everybody goes to Kinsale. Sneem, I looked it up, 2-hour drive. You can have breakfast in Kinsale, drive to Sneem, go to the pub, say you're from Newport, Rhode Island. And if they don't know the story, see, now you can tell them the story. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if you know Frank, but I want to thank him. He's been very kind to the museum for years and years and years. And he sponsored this talk. And I want to thank him. I don't think he's here, but I wanted to thank him. And I know you all came for the drawing. That's why I made this quick. But if you want, does anybody here a descendant besides me of one of the rowers? Yeah, the Malvies. Yeah, the Malvies. Yeah, but he's not here. Okay. You are here. Uh-oh. Yeah. Can you tell us who the rower is?
James Malvey was my great uncle. He was brother to my grandfather, P.J. Malvey. And it's funny because I never knew about this till Ann's father told me about it years ago down Hibernian. And I just looked at the picture and I said, James Malvey. I said, that's my great uncle.
That's
But
awesome.
just one quick little story. I went to over to Sneem. By the way, the Malvies are from this little town outside of Sneem called Gleesk.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I met this lady, Mrs. Tutterhill, that knew the whole family. And as soon as I told her that I was related to the Malvies, she goes, oh, they were fine watermen. Anyway, thanks for this lecture.
Yeah. Thank you. That's what I hope happens. I hope that happens. Are there any questions? Nothing. Yes, ma'am. Oh.
With all the betting that was going on, I wondered if there was any financial ruins for people in town.
I thought that too, a lot. I'll tell you one thing, Charlie McGowan didn't lose any money. He goes on to have a very successful career. I saw Daniel McGowan is going to spend the summer in Palm Beach. I mean, he didn't do bad. Somebody ought to do a little talk on Daniel McGowan. And the other guy, Charles H. Sullivan. You can't make this up. I don't have access to that anymore. But Charles H. Sullivan, his saloon, he was a saloon keeper. His saloon was right across the street from City Hall, a stone's throw from Garrett's and Daniel McGowan's place. They could spit at each other from their places of business. Yeah. And Charles H. Sullivan, his obituary called him, and I don't know why, they don't explain it, the Silver King. Yeah. And in his wife's obituary, they say she was the wife of the Silver King. So he doesn't do badly either. Now, the question is, I think, because I was wondering, if they lost that much money as the Globe thought they did, I was wondering, how bad was it? I think they had made so much money off the Navy in the previous years that they went, okay, there's some kind of justice here. And it really did break the fever. Then I don't know. I haven't heard. Maybe somebody has a townsperson who lost a ton of money. But who tells that story? Who tells that part? Nobody's going to tell that story at the Hibernian Hall. I'll tell you that. My grandfather got fleeced at the cutter race. Yes, sir.
They were generally from Sneem. Generally they're from Sneem, and some of them lived in Newport. So is it a mix of people from did they end up living here?
All right. A few of them went to Boston right after the race. A few of them went back, like Mike Casey did, to Ireland. And you saw that there were about 4 or 5 who stayed in Newport. Now, I think the fact that they stayed in Newport meant that this was pretty much on the up and up. I mean, a lot of people have jumped to some conclusions about this, but a lot of them stayed in Newport and they were very well thought of. So I think probably May can tell you more about what happens to some of them than I can. Yes, sir. Oh, wait a second. I'll come. I want everybody to hear. What was that guy? Phil Donahue.
Thank you, Mr. Donahue. Is that of the Newport Donahues? The question is 5 years later, August 1910, the battleships of the Atlantic Fleet were in Narragansett Bay, and Edward Berwin of the Elms invited his Naval Academy buddies who were admirals and all the officers to come to a naval ball in the ballroom at the Elms. But the focus of this, the townspeople of Newport invited all the sailors off the ships to come to a clam bake in town. Can you tell us about that?
I have no idea. But part of my motivation and the reason why I was fascinated in Maeve's story, seriously, is because I was just tired of the HBO thing. That is not Newport. There was something else going on, right? There was something else going on in the Gilded Age. It wasn't all polo and America's Cup races and a lot of balls. There were some real people living here doing some really fun things. This was fun for them. And there were baseball games and there were concerts, the music on the July 4th, there was one concert after another, and then some fireworks, and everybody went home happy. But yeah. I mean, there's what's going on in Bellevue Avenue. This is a Navy story too. This is a huge Navy story, and it's also a story about the Irish in Newport. And you know what I always say? Newport Irish history is Newport history. You can't separate them. You can't separate them. And this is a perfect example of that. Perfect example. So in that regard, your story is a good one. Yes, sir.
Why?
Okay, yeah. The July 4th race was standardized back and forth, right? This race occurred in August, and it was a special challenge match. And the Navy, I mean, people talked about why the Hibernians lost that day. And there's, right, there's a ton of, I mean, you make up your own story. I mean, I don't want to take up a lot of time, but the Navy insisted on a 4-mile straightaway. I don't know, it obviously benefited them. It obviously benefited them. They were in a longer boat. They got Lewis Raymond to build a 34-foot boat. Hibernians were in a 30-foot boat. There's so much more to this story. I don't want to tell you. I mean, there's so much more to the story. The race was supposed to occur on Friday, and the fleet didn't get back until late Friday night. And so they had it on Saturday. And they said a bunch of the Hibernian rowers had to work on Friday night. And so they stayed up, they were up all night. And one of the guys didn't have breakfast. I mean, the Globe went into gruesome details, gruesome. And there was a lot of talk about why the Hibernians lost. And then Charlie McGowan wanted to raise more money for a new boat, and nobody wanted to know. And William K. Vanderbilt has nothing to do with anything. I mean, he's out of the picture. So that's why the race, that race course with the turn, that was only for the Garrettson Cup on July 4th. All right. I mean, yeah, let's do the drawing. I will hang around if anybody has a question. Thank you very much for coming.
Doesn't get any better than that, Steve. If you'll sit for 1 minute, just hold on 1 second, if you will. That was fantastic, Steve. Before I call Kathleen up here, I just want to read something to you that I think is, it really warmed my cockles. I mentioned earlier that his students think the world of him. We have a student here tonight. I've seen 3 or 4 letters that have come into the museum, and this one came in last week. And I asked Steve if I could mention it, and he said, go for it, as you wish. He gets a letter that says, "Hi, Mr. Marino. I was in your intro and AP psych classes at GHS during my senior year and your final year, 2011 to 2012. I have been wanting to write you for a while now to say hello and let you know how much of an impact you made on me." That guy there. "I literally hear your voice in my head daily. I have an amazing 5-year-old son now, Archie. So oftentimes, the Mr. Marino quote I remind myself of is, ignore the messes and reward the successes." She remembered that 12 years later. I often imagine if I ever won some big award, I would thank you in my acceptance speech. Your energy, your storytelling, your kindness, your passion, and your humanistic approach inspired me so much. I always felt so happy in your class and so comfortable being myself. I wish I had written down your many stories, but as you always said, then you wouldn't be able to change them. What a great, and I didn't read the whole thing. I just said, I saw that and I said, it's got to be read. And I was hoping Steve would okay it. I wasn't sure, he's very modest. And I wanted to mention something about SNEAM because it's worthwhile mentioning, as chime in with May. I had the fortune 2015 to spend 2 weeks in SNEAM at the River House before I knew any of this. and it was right next to the boathouse. And every morning, sometime between 7 and 8, the rowers left the boathouse and went down the Sneem River out to sea. And every night they came back, which meant they'd been gone for hours. And when you look at the current that comes in and out of there, you understand why they're world-class rowers. Because one way, maybe both ways, but at least one way, they're going against this horrendous current. It was really spectacular. And the Casey, Stephen Crusher Casey has a statue right in the center of Sneem dedicated to him. And so the Sneem story is amazing because I don't know what the population is, but it's a couple thousand people. Just an amazing group of folks that train there and run the world. And thanks again, Steve. That was wonderful.